Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is my 2004 SD 1300. The SD is one of those bikes that you either love it or hate it. I had another SD 1300 that I rode all over, and that bike, I sold it with like 70,000 miles, and it's still, even then, the resale value on it was pretty terrible. This bike has got so many mods. It's got Race Tech front suspension, progressive rear suspension. It handles really well. The headlights have been upgraded. It's got electric windshield. It has got the V4 motor that's amazing, very unique sounding with great torque. It's got 5 speeds. It's got protection in the rear saddle cases, so a lot of protection in case you drop it. The first SD 1300 I did drop it because the car hit me from behind and it cracked the case, and these things tend to be expensive, so this one's well protected. You have preload adjustment right here. You have a little lever here that you can hold on while you put it on the center stand. Surprisingly, this bike is not hard to put on the center stand at all. The seat is so comfortable. It's an aftermarket. I think it's a Russell DeLong brand, but I'm not sure. Both the passenger and the driver are aftermarket. This particular bike, the uniqueness of it, as opposed to, say, the FJR, the weight on it is much lower. And I mean, this is heavier than the FJR and less powerful, but at the same time, it handles better than the FJR. It's got a different size front, so the front is an 18. I have an 18 front as opposed to the FJR that's got 17s on each. I prefer a larger front wheel because it handles better. My old Goldwing has got a 19-inch front wheel, which is kind of amazing. Now, these bikes are known for their reliability, which is amazing because you'd expect the resale value on these to be much higher, but it isn't. In a way, this bike should compete even now with new Goldwings. The new Goldwing is an amazing feat of engineering, and like this, Honda engineers, they put the weight low to the ground. So as opposed to the FJR, and you kind of have to compare this to the FJR. The FJR is a much sportier ride. It's also more sought after. It's smaller in stature, but the weight on it, for some reason, Yamaha likes to put the weight high up. On this one, it feels much lower. The V4 is, it's a sideways V4, and the weight on it feels so much lower. The fuel tank on this, you have 2 fuel tanks. You have one here, but then you have another one down here. That's what keeps the weight low. The battery, you're sitting right on top of it on the right side. On the Yamaha FJR, you have the battery up here. You have a 6-gallon point something up here. So it feels like the weight is very strangely mounted, because on that bike, if they did the exact same thing that Honda engineers did on this, it would feel much nicer to ride. And I'm not knocking the FJR. I had one, great bike, sounds amazing, sounds much more powerful. It is more powerful. But you know, this bike, if you're gonna go sport touring, you might as well pick a sport tourer like this. I prefer it over the FJR, but you know, it's not like I would kick the FJR out of bed. You might be wanting to buy a Honda Goldwing, and you might not even realize that these are around. So first of all, they're much more unique, they're much more rare. And the riders that get this, they just hang on to them for a really long time. There's certain problems with this bike that a lot of people just kind of glaze over. The front end tends to be a little bit vague, and I don't know how Honda could have taken care of that. It's a heavy bike, but the front end always feels strange. It's not like that big of an issue because I only ride it under 100 miles an hour. V4, it's one of those things that it makes a lot of sense in street riding. It produces so much torque throughout. With a 5-speed transmission, it's not like you have to hunt for the right gear. You're always in the right gear. A lot of people want a 6-speed on it, and I don't think that's even required. This thing feels like an automatic. It's so easy to ride. Now the weight, 700 pounds, is a lot, but because of Honda engineers, the way they made the bike, it feels so much lower to the ground that you really don't feel the weight as much as you think. It's the same thing with the new Honda Goldwing. The Honda Goldwing, it feels like black magic when you ride it. So well balanced. Now this bike could still compete with the new Honda Goldwing, and you are probably getting this for $4,000 as opposed to $27,000 for a Honda Goldwing. So you can see why this thing makes sense. The Honda ST1300 with its V4 engine makes about 125 horsepower, and it has 85 pounds of torque. As opposed to the FJR's got 144 horsepower, and it makes about 99 pounds of torque, so much higher than this bike. The FJR is also a little bit lighter at 650 pounds wet. This one's like 702 pounds wet, so the specs on this, on paper, are much worse than the FJR. But why do I like this one more than the FJR? Well, first of all, if I'm going to get a sport touring bike, I would rather it be a little bit on the touring side. The FJR, even the one I had, I thought, yeah, it kind of feels more like a sport bike. And at that point, I might want to consider a sport bike. This one, it just feels so much smoother. And the interesting thing about comparing this to the FJR, which is a good comparison, is that the weight on this bike is so much lower to the ground, not lower on a spec sheet. And that's what people need to realize about motorcycles in general. If you just go by stats, there's bikes that will just kill every other bike, like a Hayabusa. But we don't go by specs on a spec sheet. This is why engines such as V-twins, with their lower horsepower, make much more sense for 99% of the riders when they're riding on the streets. That torque, that smoothness of the engine, the way they make power, makes more sense for real-world riders as opposed to going on a racetrack. So a lot of times these bikes cannot be judged by their spec sheets, because if you go by a spec sheet, this bike is absolutely horrid. But when you ride one, you'll go, yeah, it makes a whole lot more sense. It seems as if Honda knew what they were doing. In closing, in the United States, this bike is not a popular bike because I think the US market looks at bikes based on their spec sheets. And if you're going to do that, it fails all the time. But when you move over to another continent, say Europe, this bike is much more expensive in Europe than it is in the US. And that's also one of the reasons I prefer this over the FJR or even Honda Goldwing. Getting one of these for $4,000 and then just riding it for 200,000 miles is a much better proposition than paying much more for, a Honda Goldwing for $20,000. So for me, I kind of like the uniqueness of this bike. I love that I can ride this all day long and I'm never tired. Well guys, that's the video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you hit like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.